For this project, I chose to watch Dead Poets Society. This looks at an all-boys school. It is a very established, very by the books, very organized school. These boys go here because there is a good chance that they will get into an Ivy League school after this. This movie follows Mr. Keating and his classroom. He focuses mainly on poetry with teenage boys. As you may know, teenage boys are usually not very receptive to poetry, yet Mr. Keating gets them involved with the poetry. He lets them experience the poetry and gets them to fall in love with poetry and even write poetry for themselves. This leads us to the first thing Mr. Keating did that really helped establish his positive teacher presence. Whereas most teachers in this school just had the students open the books and get right into a boring lecture, Mr. Keating began by whistling, walking through quietly, just whistling, and called the students out and took them to an old trophy room. As he says, they passed by many times but probably never took the time to really look. He begins by quoting Walt Whitman, "Oh Captain, my Captain," and really establishes himself as head of the classroom by telling his students, "If you're brave enough, you will call me Captain. Oh Captain, my Captain." And this stands out from every other lesson these boys are taught. It is in this scene that you see the boys leaning close to the glass, really looking and listening to these old pictures, waiting for them to speak to him. And while they are physically leaning into this glass, he just quietly starts whispering poetry to them and getting them to really experience poetry firsthand. Another thing Mr. Keating does to really engage his students and to keep his teacher presence positive is he does not let the class clowns and the kids who don't want to participate ruin his lesson. He goes along with it. Whenever they're writing their own poetry, one kid stands up and says a simple line and sits back down. Mr. Keating jumps off of that and says, "Yes, some of the best poetry is written from an idea so simplistic," and allows what one kid planned on using to destroy his lesson. He used that to further his lesson. In the movie, Mr. Keating does a great job with differentiation. There are several times he lets the boys experience poetry for themselves. He encourages them to march around and notice how easy it is to slip into conformity. Then he goes into poetry and how it's all about being unique, and then encourages the boys to walk around and march around in whatever manner they wish. In another scene, Mr. Keating uses a ball, getting the boys outside in the fresh air once more. They quote some line of poetry very firmly and very loudly and really proclaim that line, and then they get to kick a ball into the goal, really getting them to feel the poetry. Mr. Keating gets them to analyze the poetry, really making them think deeper into the words rather than just quoting it. He allows them to think about it and really think what it means. And then he goes on to create. These kids create their own poetry. They get to think about something in their own lives and write a poem about it. And when one kid does not know what to say, could not think of it, he doesn't have the guts to stand up and present his poetry in front of the class, Mr. Keating works with him. He takes the boy up and looks up at a picture of Emerson, an old man with a big old beard and big old white hair, and asks him, "Now what do you think?" and tells him to close his eyes, and probably not a great thing, but he firmly holds his own hands on this kid's eyes and gets him to really think and really just find poetry within him about that painting and the first thing that comes to his mind, which turns out to be a beautiful poem. While it is easy to watch this movie and think, "Oh my goodness, Mr. Keating is such a fantastic teacher, why can't all teachers be like this?" There are some things he does that are not very positive. The first thing Mr. Keating forgets to do is he forgets to set boundaries. On one of the first days, he has the students rip out the introduction from their textbook. He jumps around in his curriculum at the end when the headmaster takes over his class after he's been let go. The teacher asks where they are in the curriculum, and the boys aren't sure. He just skipped around, missing a lot, sticking to just the poems that he fancied. Mr. Keating also encourages the boys a bit too much. He tells them about his past days as a student at the school and how him and his friends snuck off in the middle of the night, went hiking through the woods, and sat in this little cave quoting poetry. Here he is enticing the boys by telling these students about what he did, breaking the rules as a student. He's encouraging them to do the same thing. Maybe not directly, but definitely indirectly. Another thing Mr. Keating does poorly is challenging authority. He's always seeming to challenge those above him. He does not explain himself in his seemingly bizarre lessons. At the end of the movie, after Mr. Keating has been let go, he cleans out his office and is walking out while the class is in session, and the class is being very defiant towards one of the head guys at school, and slowly, one by one, they stand on their desks and call out to him, "Oh, Captain, my Captain." Meanwhile, the headmaster of the school is there, red in the face, calling their names out in anger, threatening them with expulsion. Obviously, this is not something a great teacher would do. A great teacher would respect authority. Mr. Keating does not seem to follow any sort of curriculum throughout the movie. He has the students rip out the introduction to the book and to poetry at the beginning of the movie. At the end of the movie, when the headmaster is taking over his class after he's been let go, the headmaster asks the students where they are in the textbook. They cannot tell him for sure, as Mr. Keating skipped around, covering very little bits of each section of poetry. Instead of following any sort of guidelines, he just seemed to pick freely whatever poetry he deemed important. I hope you've enjoyed my thoughts on Dead Poets Society and Mr. Keating's teachings. Thank you very much for watching.